Preocupado el presidente anaranjado, viendo que las elecciones las perdió.
Solicita a los que le hacen los mandados que se apuren pues la fiesta terminó.
Y mirando que se va a acabar el varo,
han formado un titingo. Se han negado a abandonar la Casa Blanca, a la silla del despacho se amarró. Los pelitos que le quedan los arranca, pataleando por la rabia que le dio. Y mirando a Cuba con sus patas blancas, de cabeza se tiró.
El que tenga confusión que se confunda, el que quiera claridad que venga a ver.
La jugada no es compleja ni profunda, está claro cómo quieren proceder.
Solo falta que nosotros los dejemos,
y eso no va a suceder.
Con la conga de los hoyos no te metas.
Cuba viva sin que nadie la someta. Mi tierra linda, mi cubanía, mi bandera se respeta. De La Habana para Santiago, defiende lo tuyo, cubano.
que no te metas con mi tierra, que mi Cuba se respeta.
Soy el mambí que aún vive con el machete en la mano. No, 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 no. ¿Qué me importa si comentas?
De donde vengo yo, estamos listos para la contienda. Aguanta ahí, pero dime tú, ¿pa' qué tú inventas? Con mi pueblo guarachando, yo vine aquí para cantar. Toda Cuba está esperando que yo la ponga a gozar.
Aquí nadie tiene miedo, tú conmigo no te metas. Oh, no. ¡Hey! Oye, eso que todo mi alegría te molesta.
Porque tú me conoces bien en todas mis facetas. Que no tenemos miedo, sal de ahí, no abra esa gaveta.
Buenas tardes a todos los amigos que nos escuchan y nos ven. Mi nombre es Julio Fonseca y yo soy uno de los copresidentes de la Red Canadiense de Solidaridad con Cuba. Hoy estamos en un evento pre-convención porque mañana y el domingo tenemos la 11ª convención de la CNC y va a tener lugar aquí en Toronto. Hoy tenemos un evento de solidaridad que no solo hace referencia a la situación de Cuba, también hace referencia a todos los pueblos del mundo que están sufriendo el impacto de las medidas y de la agresión de los Estados Unidos. Y ahí tenemos al pueblo de Gaza, ahí tenemos a Irán y también, por supuesto, tenemos al pueblo de Cuba. Es absolutamente necesario que todas las personas que amen la paz, todas las personas que aún tienen amor por Cuba, por la democracia real, inclusiva y por los derechos humanos, intervenir y denunciar el asedio genocida contra el inocente pueblo cubano. Esto es un castigo colectivo que implica a un crimen de lesa humanidad. Están tratando de matar a un pueblo entero por hambre y necesidades con el propósito de derrocar el gobierno constitucional de Cuba. Es absolutamente necesario que la solidaridad, no solo aquí en Canadá o en Norteamérica, sino en todo el mundo, se haga expresar, que eleve su voz por un futuro mejor, un futuro donde haya paz, donde haya respeto real por los derechos humanos para todos los seres humanos y no selectivo, y que se acabe de entender que Cuba tiene el derecho a la autodeterminación. Eso es un derecho del pueblo cubano y de todos los pueblos del mundo. Nosotros tenemos que oponernos resueltamente a una agresión militar contra Cuba. Eso sería el colmo y crearía una catástrofe humanitaria de consecuencias incalculables, tanto para el pueblo de Cuba como para el pueblo de Estados Unidos. Que viva Cuba libre y abajo el bloqueo.
I'm Samantha Hislop, co-chair of the Canadian Network on Cuba, and we're here in Toronto tonight at the event On the Edge of Catastrophe, From Gaza to Havana, Imperialism and the Struggle for Humanity's Survival. And we're here hearing from guest speakers talking about what imperialism looks like, the forms that it takes, whether it's in the form of military aggression, or in the case of Cuba, economic strangulation through over 6 decades of economic sanctions. So, the goal here is to, not just offer words of solidarity, but discuss and come up with a plan of action for how we can mobilize and pressure our governments here in Canada to take action against the U.S. blockade, break the blockade, work with other countries such as Mexico to get oil to Cuba, to send aid to Cuba, to not be complicit in these devastating measures, these genocidal measures of the United States against Cuba. It's been a really good night so far, and we will overcome. The world stands with Cuba, Canada stands with Cuba. Venceremos.
Greetings, everybody. Greetings. Welcome to the Revolution Within the Revolution podcast. My name is Onya Sanwu. I am one of your hosts. I'm here by my lonesome today, but my comrade will be back next week. I am one of the 5 elected co-chairs of the National Network on Cuba, and this is the Revolution Within the Revolution podcast, a weekly show that we do every Friday at 1 p.m. Eastern, talking about developments in the global movement in solidarity with Cuba, trying to bring an end to the genocidal U.S. blockade. The clip you were just watching was some footage our comrade Cesar, another of the elected co-chairs of the National Network on Cuba, took when he was there in Toronto at the Canadian Network on Cuba's national meeting alongside yet another co-chair, Cheryl Labash. And so the comrades of the Canadian Network on Cuba had an amazing meeting talking about the necessity of building a global movement in solidarity with Cuba, the necessity of pressuring the Canadian government to break the oil blockade because they have the oil. They're close. They can send it. They just need the pressure from the mass movement to help them overcome the puppetry of the U.S. empire that they're submitting to at the moment. So shout out to those comrades, and also shout out to them for connecting the struggle against the blockade, the struggle in solidarity with Cuba, with the global struggle against imperialism. It's connected to the struggle against Zionism and occupied Palestine. It's connected to the struggle against French and imperialist-backed terrorism in the Alliance of Sahel states. It's connected to the struggle in Venezuela, in Nicaragua, in Iran, in China, all over the world, baby. Sometimes some people think that if we talk about imperialism, we're going to scare the hoes. I'm sorry, scare like the regular people. But I'm like, Lenin wrote imperialism in the early 20th century in like 1919 or something like that. And working class people have been reading it without getting scared away ever since. And so I think actually it's okay for us to use the word because that's really what we're up against, right? Anyway, so today on the show, before I get into what we're going to talk about this in the show, I just want to first and foremost, say free Nicolas Maduro and free Celia Flores, who are still being detained in New York City on trumped up charges made up by the US government, accusing them of being narco traffickers, narco terrorists, to depose them from their positions in the government of Venezuela, to persecute them in the US injustice system, and to attempt to destroy the Bolivarian Revolution. That's what it's really about. It's not about drug trafficking. It's not that Nicolas Maduro and Celia Flores have actually done what they're accused of. It's literally the US government trying to destroy the socialist and anti-imperialist project of the Venezuelan people by targeting these individuals. So free them till it's backward, period, and understand that the struggle in Venezuela is connected to the struggle in Cuba, is connected to the struggle in Palestine, is connected to the struggle in the AES, and so on and so forth. It's all connected. We have to fight many, many, many different battles because the enemy is hitting us on many, many different fronts. Another place where the enemy is hitting us is that the U.S. military is currently continuing to carry out airstrikes against fishing boats in the Caribbean Sea and in the Pacific Ocean. They have killed over 200 people that the U.S. military is saying are narco traffickers, narco terrorists, whatever the hell that means. However, no one that has been killed has been charged with any crime. And in fact, when people on these fishing boats have been surviving these airstrikes, the U.S. government has declined to charge them. It's not even trying to attempt to prove what it's saying about these folks, that it is bombing from the sky, drone bombing fishing boats, over 200 people killed. So we have to keep talking about that. The U.S. is calling it Operation Southern Spear. What it is straight up extrajudicial killings of fishermen on sailboats in the Caribbean Sea, in the Pacific Ocean. It's actually wild how long this has been happening without some kind of global outcry. The U.S. is truly acting with the same impunity in the Western Hemisphere as the Zionist entity has been acting with in Lebanon and occupied Palestine. And you see what happens when you don't speak out against it in one part of the world, when you don't stop it in one part of the world, it always, always, always comes back on you. That's how imperialism functions. So today on the show, we are going to be doing a deep dive into traitor to the Cuban people, Marco Rubio, the current U.S. Secretary of State, the architect of the Trump administration's policy towards Nuestra America, and an overall piece of garbage, just true piece of opportunistic garbage. We're going to be breaking down his life story, his political line, and how he developed in quite this way. Because let me tell you, there is a difference between the people who were developed in and by the Cuban Revolution and the people that were developed in the United States when it comes to Cubans. I'll just say that. And I feel like Marco Rubio is a really clear example of what I mean by that. So we're going to get into it. But this day in Cuban history, today is Friday, June 12th. This day in 1955, on June 12th, was the official founding of the 26th of July movement. Fidel Castro, Raul Castro, Camilo Cienfuegos, Juan Alameda Bosque were all part of the attack on the Moncada garrison. They saw many of their comrades killed in the repelling of that attack. Many of them were imprisoned, including Fidel himself, where he wrote that famous speech, "History will absolve me." After a successful mass movement in Cuba, the political prisoners who survived the attack on the Moncada garrison were released. They traveled to Mexico. They did not give up. They were not put aside by that initial failure of the attack on the garrison. Instead, they regrouped in Mexico. And on this day, they officially founded the 26th of July movement with a national directorate that was led by Fidel Castro. And the objective of that 26th of July movement was to form a guerrilla struggle that could successfully overthrow the U.S. puppet Batista. And of course, they did it just 4 years later in 1959. But today was the day when the July 26th movement was officially founded. So we definitely want to uplift that history because, again, it shows you the kind of people, the kind of Cubans that are developed in the context of the revolutionary struggle, in the context of Cuba's struggle for independence. Like the people, like they were massacred, they were imprisoned, they were tortured, they saw their comrades kidnapped and tortured and killed, and none of that stopped them from fighting for the freedom of all of Cuba. None of that stopped them from organizing to come back and hit the U.S. puppet Batista even harder. They were completely dedicated to the independence of Cuba from imperialism, from capitalism. They wanted a Cuba that was organized around the interests of the masses of Cuban people. That is the kind of Cuban that is forged in revolutionary struggle. But what we have in the United States, particularly in elected office, particularly in positions of power in South Florida, is the kind of Cuban that develops under the influence of U.S. settler colonialism and U.S. imperialism, exemplified by a man like Marco Rubio. So shout out to the founders of the July 26th movement. Shout out to the victory of the Cuban Revolution just 4 years later. Shout out to the indomitable spirit of the revolutionary Cuban. That is what the Cuban Revolution has given us, has shown us. It produces like such heroes, such models of the liberation struggle. And here in the United States, we get diasporas that are taught to turn against their own people, to starve them, to bomb them, to sanction them, and say it's for their own good. Goddamn. But before we get into the deep dive into how much Marco Rubio sucks, I just want to give some updates on the global No War on Cuba campaign. And for that, I'm going to change my background. Look at that. Look at that. Week of action dates on the bottom right there. Week of action is happening June 28th to July 4th. So the International No War on Cuba campaign is a global organized movement seeking to take coordinated action to end U.S. military aggression against Cuba and the U.S. war on Cuba. Our demands include an end, of course, to all U.S. military escalation against Cuba. We demand the removal of Cuba from the United States State Department's list of state sponsors of terrorism, something that Marco Rubio pushed for very hard. Like, he was instrumental in defining the maximum pressure campaign, not just against Cuba, but also against Venezuela, against a lot of other places. But putting Cuba on the State Department's list of state sponsors of terrorism, that was a Rubio move, baby. So they need to be off that list, because their listing on that farce of a list means that they are cut off from the international financial system. They cannot open bank accounts. They cannot obtain loans. They cannot obtain cash, because banks do not want to be accused of supporting terrorism or funding terrorism or laundering money for terrorism. So like, it's not worth the risk. We are not doing business with Cuba. And that means that Cuba cannot get the income it needs to buy the things it needs to meet the needs of its population, to improve its infrastructure. So Cuba needs to be off that list. It's one of the key aspects of Cuba's economic isolation at this moment. The No War on Cuba campaign also demands an end to the genocidal U.S. economic blockade on Cuba. Every single week at this point, we are getting new executive orders issuing new sanctions on different entities, different Cubans, and it is all contributing to the Byzantine network of laws that make up the U.S. blockade on Cuba. It is not just one piece of legislation, but like a collection of policies and pieces of legislation and restrictions that make up the economic blockade. And the intent of that blockade, just like the Mali Memorandum says, is to cause suffering and starvation amongst the Cuban people, to make them suffer so much, to make them so desperate that they rise up and overthrow their own revolutionary project, their own revolutionary government. This genocidal condition has been imposed on Cuba for 6 decades at this point, and it hasn't worked yet. And so really all that's happening with this economic blockade is mass suffering and starvation and increased death in Cuba for no policy wins for the United States. An additional demand of the No War on Cuba campaign is the closing of the concentration camp which the U.S. military runs on Cuban territory, that being the military base at Guantanamo Bay. We demand the closing of Guantanamo Bay and the return of Guantanamo Bay to the Cuban people, period. And we are calling for normalized relations between the United States and Cuba. It has been over 6 decades of attempting to overthrow the revolution, of attempting to assassinate their democratically elected leaders, of engaging in acts of terrorism, targeting civilians, of economic isolation, of oil blockades. This is not the first time the U.S. has done this. So over 6 decades of this policy, intentionally targeting and terrorizing Cuban civilians with no policy wins for the United States. The Cuban government, the Cuban Revolution has up until this point refused to give up its independence, refused to concede socialism or anti-imperialism as priorities of their revolutionary project. And so what is really showing you is that you can't bully people, you can't starve people into getting your way. Once they have decided they are going to be free, it doesn't matter if you lock them up, it doesn't matter if you murder them, it doesn't matter if you exile them, it doesn't matter if you blockade them, they are going to fight to remain free. So really, what the U.S. should do, if it wants to have some kind of say in Cuba's foreign relations or whatever, it should have the right to have a say in it, then it should have normalized relations as equal nations. Like, negotiate as equals. Don't tell them what kind of system they should have. Don't tell them who they can and cannot be friends with. Don't tell them that they're not allowed to be socialists. No, like, that's not how you treat an equal. When you engage each other as equals in international relations, the way that the government is organized is not on the table. Who they are friends with is not on the table. Socialism is not on the table because you should not get a say in how another nation functions. We need normalized relations between the United States and Cuba, relations between equals. And of course, another demand and the last demand of the International No War on Cuba movement is an end to military and financial support for the United States war machine anywhere in the world. Because like we keep saying on the program, the very same forces that are blockading Cuba, the very same forces that invaded Venezuela and kidnapped Nicolas Maduro and Celia Flores and killed 100 people, including 32 Cubans, the very same forces that attempted to orchestrate an uprising in Mali with terrorists that were armed and funded by France to overthrow the revolutionary government. It's all the same people giving us hell, the same people trying to provoke Taiwan into an extremely doomed war with China. It's literally the same people doing it to all of us for the same reason. It is a global ruling class led by the United States attempting to destroy working people's movements all over the planet. Like that is what war is about. And so we want no more of that. Stop the United States. And so that is another key demand of the No War on Cuba campaign. And so far in the International No War on Cuba campaign, we have had our International Day of Action. It happened about 2 weeks ago on Wednesday, June 3rd. We had actions in Puerto Rico. We had actions in Mexico. We had actions throughout the United States carried out by Action for Cuba committees and other forces in solidarity with the Cuban Revolution that are part of the National Network on Cuba. And so it is expanding. We've had a series of national and international meetings since to increase our collaboration. We have also launched the No War on Cuba website. It's on the slide, but I will also put it in the chat. And the No War on Cuba website, nowaroncuba.com, is your one-stop shop for resources to support your local organizing as part of the No War on Cuba campaign. So we have logos. This is the logo right here on the corner. Can I point to it? Can I point to it? Right there. So we have logos in different colors, different languages that people are using all over the world to promote their actions to signify they're part of the No War on Cuba campaign. We have graphics, a branding kit that has like flyer templates where you can just like plug in your statement or plug in the information about your local event and post it without having to do a lot of graphic design. Like the NNOC has graphic designers on deck, and the ACC media team, and they have done a lot of work to make sure that very attractive and polished graphics are available for organizing all over the world. We also have our No War on Cuba toolkit that compiles all of these resources linked at the top of the website. We have a guide to how to power map. Power mapping is basically finding people who are down to work on the same thing you are in your area, like allied organizations, even organizations that you don't know are on your side, but maybe could be with like a little pressure. That's who power mapping helps you identify. So we have that guide on the website. And we also have a national rapid response plan for the United States that the National Network on Cuba approved at our spring meeting at the end of May. And now all over the United States, NNOC organizations are organizing rapid responses in the event of a US military attack on Cuba, saying, if this happens, we show up at this time, at this place. Basically, we need to, across the United States, across the world, have rapid response plans in place so that if the US makes the extremely poor decision to carry out a military attack on Cuba, or even to move military resources in striking distance of Cuba, or invade Cuba to attempt to kidnap a 95-year-old man, then we're going to move. We're going to turn up, we're going to be in the streets, and we are going to demonstrate to the US government that there's going to be material and political consequences if they lay a finger on Cuba. So go to nowaroncuba.com for all of those resources. And then another way that I just want to uplift that we can support Cuba in this moment is to continue to send material aid and brigades to the island. The US government is working overtime to target key industries in Cuba. I'm talking energy, I'm talking mining, and now with the new sanctions announced on ECAP and Amastor, they're also targeting tourism in the solidarity movement. They are trying to intimidate us away from being friends with Cuba, from traveling to Cuba, from providing material aid to Cuba so that they can increase the suffocation and the suffering of the Cuban people. We cannot be intimidated. We cannot allow that to stop us from organizing to bring material aid and to stop us from traveling to Cuba. You can still travel to Cuba. It is still a legal and licensed trip. You can still buy a flight. And in fact, there are at least 2 brigades coming from the United States to Cuba in August, the Centenario Fidel Brigade, organized by the National Network on Cuba, and the Venceremos Brigade is going to be traveling there August 1st to 15th for, as the name says, the Centenario Fidel Castro's 100th birthday. We are bringing over 100 people, and we are also raising money to bring 2 charter planes full of material aid to the island to break that blockade, both with our bodies, with our actions, and also with material support, with material aid. So if you would like to support those efforts to bring folks to this island at this critical time, and also to help us fill those 2 planes, I put the link to donate in the chat. It's bit.ly/aid4COF. I'm also going to have it up with a QR code later in the show at the end, but you can get that link in the chat right now if you're just itching to donate. And then another member of the National Network on Cuba that is traveling to the island in August is IFCO Pastors for Peace, our comrades at Pastors for Peace. They are bringing a brigade for the centenary of Fidel as well, and they are currently running a fundraiser to fill a shipping container with material aid to send to Cuba. And so I'll put that link in the chat as well. And if you just got paid, drop a little at both links. Help us meet our goal. Help us bring as much material aid as possible to Cuba. Again, we cannot be intimidated. We cannot allow the US government to tell us who our friends are. We as US citizens have the right to freely travel and associate with whom we please. And we are not breaking any laws by bringing material aid to Cuba, period. So we cannot allow Cuba to be alone in this moment. So please donate, please support the fundraisers, and please check out NoWarOnCuba.com. Plug into that week of action, June 28th to July 4th, and use the resources on the website to plan your actions. We tried to make it as easy as possible. You just take the bodies and the buddies. That's it. Okay, so the topic of the show today, I'm going to go back to the original background. The topic of the show today is U.S. Secretary of State, architect of Trump administration's policy towards not just Cuba, but in Western America as a whole, all of Turtle Island, Marco Rubio. So you probably know that Marco Rubio is Cuban American. He was born in Miami, Florida, to a family of Cuban immigrants. His father was a bartender. His mother was a maid. So he had like a working class background. What a part of Rubio's personal narrative, which has since been debunked, is that his family came to Miami fleeing the Castro regime. The issue, however, is that his family came to Miami in 1956 when not Castro, but Batista, U.S. puppet Batista, was in power. So his family was not fleeing communism. His family was fleeing the conditions of degradation and violence created by a U.S.-backed dictator, Batista. So off top, wow. However, they got to Miami, and the victory of the Cuban Revolution came 3 years later in 1959, and with that, a flood of right-wing Cubans to Miami who opposed the Cuban Revolution, who opposed Castro, and so the anti-Castro vibes were high as hell in Miami, and the Rubio family, to assimilate, fell in with them anti-Castro Cubans as well, even though they had never lived in Cuba when Fidel Castro and the Communist Party of Cuba were in power. In order to make it in Miami, in order to assimilate, in order to successfully integrate, you have to be anti-Castro. If you're Cuban, you got to. And so, yeah, they never experienced it, but they definitely opposed it. When Marco Rubio was like a kid, his family moved to Vegas so his dad could get another job as a bartender. They only ended up staying there for 2 years. I can imagine. I come from a tropical place. Lived in New Mexico for a long time. I love New Mexico, but it's really dry. And that's why I came here to Seminole Territory, to Florida. So I can imagine what a Cuban family was feeling in Las Vegas. They were like, that's enough of that. So they returned to Miami. In that period, Marco Rubio's sister marries a man named Orlando Cecilia. Orlando Cecilia happens to be a drug trafficker, like a major drug trafficker, or he was at the time, who worked with a drug trafficker that was connected to Pablo Escobar. They moved millions and millions and millions of dollars of cocaine between Central and South America and the United States via their operations in Miami. So the Rubio family moves to Vegas. They decide that's enough of this dry heat. We're going back to Miami. And when they return to Miami, they stay in Orlando Cecilia's house, the house that he has with Marco Rubio's sister, Barbara Rubio. And the drug trafficking operations, the massive sales of cocaine, I think it was like $75 million of cocaine trafficked that he went down for. A lot of that was happening out of his house. Like in his trial for trafficking cocaine, he has like colleagues who say that he had like kilos stored in a spare bedroom. Marco Rubio's family is staying in the home upon their return to Miami for about a month until they found a place. But then even after they left Orlando, Cecilia, and Barbara Rubio's house, teenage Marco Rubio, would be going there every week to care for Orlando Cecilia's 7 dogs. So when Orlando Cecilia went down in like the sting, for federal drug charges, the Rubio family said, we had no idea what was going on. We didn't know. And I'm just like, $75 million worth of cocaine? And he was storing kilos in a spare bedroom. And it was like a family of 5 living in the house as he was doing this. And then the kid was over every week. And you're saying you didn't know? Like, even a cop that was involved in the case was like, I find that very hard to believe. But that's the story that the Rubio family stuck with, that Marco Rubio has stuck to this day. But Orlando Cecilia was convicted of trafficking that $75 million of cocaine when Marco Rubio was 16. He was sentenced to 35 years in prison. He served 12 years for trafficking $75 million of cocaine, and he was released from prison in the year 2000. The money that he made from selling the drugs was never recovered. It was never recovered by the feds. Also, he's still living in the United States. Okay, so I want to say this. I am a colonized person with a working class background. Many colonized people who have families with working class background, like we are familiar with like the criminalization of our communities. And we are also familiar with how the lack of access to stable employment, to the things that we need to live under the capitalist system, can push poor working class and colonized people into crime, into drug crime. So I'm saying, like, having someone related to you with charges is not like disqualifying for anything, especially for like a working class person. However, at this particular point in history, like Marco Rubio's whole career, his like antagonism towards immigration, the narrative that he's spinning about Venezuela, about Cuba, about anti-imperialist and progressive governments in the Western Hemisphere is like deeply tied to this narrative of narco-terrorism, of narco-trafficking. He's saying that all of these countries are flooding the United States with migrants. These migrants are committing crimes, and we need to stop the flow of drugs at the source by bombing fishing boats and by overthrowing democratically elected governments and by imposing sanctions on countries that don't do what we say. And we have to engage, like he supports the Trump administration's like mass deportation program, but at the same time, his brother-in-law was moving $75 million worth of cocaine. You were in the crib while it was happening. And then even after you moved out, you were at the crib every week feeding the dogs. And then he gets sentenced. He gets the 35 years. He only serves 12. He gets out in 2000. In 2002, Marco Rubio he's elected to the Florida House of Representatives in 1999. And that's like the beginning of his political career. Actually, before that, he served in the West Miami City Council for 2 years. And then he gets elected to the Florida House of Representatives. Then in 2002, while he's in the Florida House of Representatives, he writes a letter. So this is 2 years after Orlando Cecilia gets out of jail. He writes a letter to the Florida Division of Real Estate, basically recommending that they give Orlando Cecilia a real estate license. In that letter, Marco Rubio does not disclose the fact that Orlando Cecilia is his brother-in-law, and he also does not disclose that he got charged and convicted of trafficking $75 million in cocaine. He was like, he's a really good guy. You should let him get a real estate license. Yeah. And then also, like, throughout his political career, so he's like in the Florida House for like around 10 years. He becomes the first Cuban-American speaker of the Florida House of Representatives in 2006. He releases his memoir because he starts to have presidential ambitions. Like, really, like, throughout his life, you can see this like constant mindset of trying to like climb to the top, like trying to reach the next level. He goes from like city council to Florida House to the U.S. Senate to running for president, failing, losing to Trump, to Secretary of State, and you can clearly see like he's aiming for the White House. But anyway, he's constantly moving up. But so throughout this period of like running for Senate, running for president, Orlando Cecilia is there. Like, you can see campaign events from Marco Rubio's 2016 presidential campaign where Orlando Cecilia is like literally on the stage behind him. So I'm like, how are you waging war against the whole hemisphere? Because you're saying we got to stamp out these narco traffickers, this narco terrorism. How are you backing mass deportation of Cuban Americans, Venezuelan Americans, Haitians, like so many people getting deported from Florida? You don't say a word. And your own brother-in-law didn't even serve half his sentence. Got out early. And I guarantee you that Marco Rubio has something to do with that too. Then you write him a letter of recommendation so he can sell houses in Hialeah. Then you run for president and he's like right there. And you're telling me that Marco Rubio's objection to narco-terrorism is like a moral, you know what I'm saying? Like it's such a clear contradiction. It's like rules for thee and not for me is what we're seeing in this ongoing relationship with Orlando Cia. Like I said, a lot of working class people, a lot of colonized people, we have family members with charges. That does not make anyone a bad person, even the person with charges sometimes. However, you cannot, like this person did major damage, like $75 million in cocaine comes with like a whole bunch of violence all around it. It comes with like a transnational criminal operation. That's how you get to the kilos in the spare bedroom. And you're still fucking with him. While you're providing comfort for the US government, blowing up fishing boats that you don't even know if they're drug dealers or not. Oh my God. So anyway, I gave so he runs for the Florida House of Representatives in 1999. He's elected. He writes a letter in 2002. He becomes the first Cuban American speaker of the Florida House of Representatives. And in this whole time, he's basically doing, like, he's like a moderate Republican. Like, he's known amongst his colleagues for like reaching across the aisle to work with the Democrats to pass measures for Florida. He's getting money for schools. He's getting money for undocumented folks. Like, he's like actually advocating to the most extent possible, like in bourgeois politics. He's actually advocating for his constituents because he's trying to stay in that seat. Then in 2009, his tenure as the Florida Speaker of the House ends, and there's like term limits in the Florida House of Representatives, which means he cannot run again. And so this is when he's like, I'm going to run for the Senate. And in order to successfully like win the Senate seat, he straight up embraces the Tea Party. He goes from like this moderate Republican reaching across the aisle, neoliberal, to like full on like small government, like right-wing populist, like, you know, full on, like, I don't know if people remember the Tea Party, but it's like very similar to MAGA now, where it went like much to the right of the existing Republicans, where there was like a lot of like white supremacist dog whistling, where they talked about like small government and like America first. Like, it was kind of like the precursor to what would become the MAGA movement. So that's what Marco Rubio embraces to get the Senate seat, and he does it successfully. And then while he's in the Senate, he serves on the two key committees: the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, which he and Bob Menendez, he's in jail now. We don't talk about him anymore, but he's the Democratic senator from New Jersey that was virulently anti-Cuban. He's also Cuban American, had not lived in Cuba under Castro, was virulently Cuban anti-communist, anti-Cuban revolution. So they're on there together. They're also, like, at the time they were elected, the only Hispanic American senators in the whole house. Anyway, so they're on that committee together, learning about U.S. foreign policy. And then Marco Rubio is also on the Intelligence Committee, which oversees the CIA and the NSA. And so you can imagine he goes from a focus on Florida politics and an ideological alignment with anti-communism, with hostility to the Cuban Revolution, to being on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and the Intelligence Committee, having constant interaction with the apparatus of U.S. imperialism, with the CIA, with the NSA, with the State Department. He's like at the meetings, he's hearing the hearings, he's seeing the evidence for how U.S. imperialism is carried out all over the world, and he becomes a true believer, a neoliberal, a conservative. He is all about like the soft power approach to imperialism. Like, he was a huge supporter of foreign aid as a way of extending U.S. power around the world. He was a huge supporter of U.S. aid. In fact, he wrote a letter to Biden when he was still a senator in 2022, requesting more money for U.S. aid to counter the growing risk from China. And then right afterwards, like 2 years later in the Trump administration, he was like, I was always against U.S. aid. So he basically is like completely aligned with like the Hillary Clintons, the Obamas, the Bush approach to imperialism, where you're still trying to overthrow governments that are hostile to imperialism, or that are trying to build socialism, or are trying to build communism, but you're trying to do it with like the underhanded, like color revolution way, where you're funding dissident groups, where you're using aid as a tether to make government submissive to you. Like, he was all about that shit. So in fact, he also was a big supporter of the Obama and Biden administration proxy war against Russia carried out via Ukraine. Like, they basically, like, you know, the United States, everybody knows the story. The United States like surrounded Russia with like NATO military bases and then overthrew a reasonable government in Ukraine and instead put in a far right-wing government, like straight up Nazis. And then that far right-wing government initiated like a antagonism against Russia that Russia was forced to respond to. And so the Trump administration has been very, very hostile to this proxy war against Russia in Ukraine. But before he was against it, Marco Rubio was for it. And when the Russian operation in Crimea happened, he gave like a floor speech saying that we need to counter Russia. We need to sanction Putin. Like, he was a full-throated supporter of the proxy war until he got into the Trump administration. And that's another thing that you see throughout his career, where he'll take a political position and then immediately abandon it as soon as it does not further his interests. Another example of this is that when he was in the Senate, he became part of what was known as the Gang of Eight, which is basically Republican senators that supported immigration reform because they were trying to move to the left of Obama when it came to Latino voters. They thought, like, because Obama was the deporter in chief. And so they were like, we can kind of like outmaneuver him on this issue. We have a Latino Republican, Marco Rubio, and so we're going to try to pass immigration reform. And Marco Rubio initially was all for it. He was like a very powerful spokesperson because he was from a family of immigrants. He was the only Latino in the Gang of Eight. Like, people were like, okay, this makes sense. And then when it became clear that supporting immigration reform, trying to move to the left of Obama on immigration reform, was going to hurt his presidential ambitions, this child of immigrants, Marco Rubio, was like, never mind. And he abandoned it, and the whole thing fell apart. So again, like, throughout his political career, you see like consistent anti-communism, you see consistent hostility to socialist and anti-imperialist projects, but you also see a willingness to go with whatever the hot take is at the time. Like, he will completely abandon his prior positions to go with what the new hotness is. Like, before, he was like a Bush, like a Dick Cheney-esque Republican. Now he's full on make America great again because he doesn't give a damn. He's just trying to move his way up. So he serves in the Senate. He's on those two committees. He's learning more and more about U.S. imperialism, becoming instrumental in different strategies of imperialism, becoming extremely hostile to China and to Russia, and maintaining that hostility to the Cuban Revolution and other anti-imperialist projects in Western America. He starts to consider moving up even more. And so in 2016, he runs in the Republican primary to get the Republican nomination for president. And I remember that election season, and it was absurd. It was absurd. The first time around when Trump was running, and they were throwing all these people at him, and he was just like flicking them all off, just like disrespecting them openly on the public stage, and no one really knew. Like, there didn't really seem like any of them could stop him. I guess they didn't. So, but I don't know if folks remember, like, during that primary, that Trump and Rubio were like constantly bickering. Like, Rubio called him a con artist, said that he was like perpetuating a scam against the American public. Trump like started to call him names. I'm trying to remember like the exact shit. I remember Marco Rubio said he had small hands, and then Trump said something about his hair. It was like a whole thing. They were going back and forth, beefing, insulting each other. But as it turns out, they got along the whole time. Like, in front of the cameras, they were like, your hands are small, your hair's stupid. But behind the cameras, they were like chopping it up, getting along, making friends, getting closer. So when the primary happens, Rubio loses his home state of Florida to Trump. I think he lost like every district except his home district in West Miami. And then after that was like too embarrassing. So he drops out of the 2016 presidential race and runs for his Senate seat again instead. And he wins the seat back and he goes back to the Senate. But when Trump won the election, Rubio was one of his first choices for VP, for vice president. But Trump like wanted him, but Rubio did not pursue it. And that's kind of interesting. And I feel like it's because being a VP in the Trump administration is a truly thankless job. Like, do y'all see how they have JD Vance in a corner? They bring him out from time to time to say something racist or to attempt to like negotiate like that. He was like the first line negotiator in Iran, but then like Stephen Miller and the other one, Witkoff, were like, no, no, he's a pussy. Like, they didn't want him because he wanted to like make an actual deal to end the war, and they wanted to take the Zionist position, like Israel's position, to keep it going. And so they were like, get this man out of here. And so like they'll like pull him out. He'll say something stupid or racist or white supremacist, and then you won't see him again for weeks. So I'm sure that Rubio peeped that, and he also peeped Pence. Probably Pence is what he was looking at. Pence in the first Trump administration was, just like completely sidelined. And anytime he tried to like inject some like rational thinking, rarely, Trump would just like attack him publicly. Like after the January 6th invasion of the Capitol by like a bunch of unhinged right-wing people, Mike Pence tried to be like, that was kind of wild. Like, why did that happen? And Trump just like threw him completely under the bus and has been attacking him ever since. And so, a VP in the Trump administration seems like a very, very thankless job. And it's not what Rubio was looking for. Instead, the second time around when Trump won, Rubio spoke to Trump about serving as the Secretary of State. And the reason why he wanted to be Secretary of State is because he wanted to be the main driver of U.S. policy in Western America, in Central and South America, and the Caribbean. That is the reason why he approached Trump about being Secretary of State and why he agreed to do it. And he has functioned as the main architect of Trump administration policy towards Western America. He got exactly what he wanted. He has also functioned as a willing puppet of the Trump administration, where they will do unhinged, stupid ass things like attacking Iran and getting like Strait of Hormuz closed to any traffic that Iran does not approve. And Marco Rubio will go out there and talk about it like it was a good idea. Actually, I have an example of this. Like another example is like the Trump administration. I just learned this because I don't be paying attention to like the day-to-day ridiculous things that Trump does, like says or does. So I missed this until recently, that there's going to be a UFC fight at the White House on July 4th. They're building like a big tent, and they want to celebrate the bicentennial, the 250th birthday of the United States, with the UFC fight at the White House. Wow, that's crazy. But here is Marco Rubio explaining why it's a good idea.
The whole idea of America is audacious. The very idea that America, that you could have a country where founded on the principle that your rights come not from your government or from your leaders, your rights come from your creator, was an audacious idea. No one else believed that at the world at that time. And that's the foundation. But then beyond that, everything we've done since then as a nation, time and again. How can you achieve some of the things? We're going to put a man on the moon. When President Kennedy announced that we were going to put a man on the moon and return him safely to the earth, no one thought that was possible, and we did it. We are a nation founded on doing what no one else dared to do and no one else aspired to do. And at some level, that's what this whole company, what UFC has been.
No, he was dead ass. He said he brought up the moon landing, and then he compared it to the UFC as a company, and the fight at the website. And when you watch, I highly recommend, to prepare for this show, I watched like a lot of interviews and like press conferences and Senate hearings of Marco Rubio explaining the Trump administration's foreign policy. And like, the man is like a good speaker. Like he's very, very, he can sell anything. He can sell ice to a snowman, and he really has like no shame or self-respect. And so you can tell, like, even when it's like an obviously stupid idea, like having a UFC fight at the fucking White House, he will just explain it like it's the most reasonable thing in the world. And if you have an issue with it, you're the one with the problem. Like he does that a lot. Like when people are like, are you trying to like invade Cuba and do like a nation building project? And he's like, that's a stupid question. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like he's like, he'll act like a reasonable critique or questions about absurd things are completely irrational and stupid. And then he will also like wrap like the absurd thing that he's like trying to present in like language that like normalizes it. Like I highly recommend, if you can stomach it, like watching his interviews, watching his statements, because it doesn't matter what he's saying. It doesn't matter how absurd or how monstrous or how barbaric it is. He has this way of spinning it like it's the most normal thing in the world, and you are the one with the problem if you question it. So he's currently serving as the Trump administration's Secretary of State. In that capacity, he has been a willing puppet of the Trump agenda. He has weaponized visas as a tactic to repress folks speaking out against U.S. imperialism. He has revoked the visas of at least 85,000 people, most of them including a number of students who protested for occupied Palestine, barring them on the grounds that they constituted a threat to the citizens, culture, government institutions, or founding principles of the United States. So this is like students engaging in like First Amendment protected speech and action at protests, speaking out against U.S. policy in Palestine as is their right, and then the U.S. State Department under Marco Rubio attacking them, like revoking their visas, saying they have to leave the United States for the so-called crime of criticizing the U.S. government. These are the same people that fix their mouths to say that Cuba is a dictatorship where you cannot protest the government, where you cannot criticize the government, and here they are kicking people out for doing things like writing op-eds or protesting for Palestine. Additionally, the State Department under the Trump administration really like throughout its history has like open white nationalism. Like it's like masked off fully. Like Marco Rubio gave that speech in Munich in February of this year, where he was basically like the Europe has to get on the same page and join the United States and defend Western civilization. Western clearly meaning white civilization. He has issued State Department memos like with his name on it, encouraging U.S. embassies to report their colleagues for anti-Christian bias. So there's like an open white nationalist agenda at work in the State Department. And Marco Rubio, a Cuban American, is with it, uplifts it. He has additionally used his power as the Secretary of State to bar judges from the International Criminal Court who have attempted to condemn Israeli genocide in Gaza from entering the United States. He also one time revoked the president of Colombia's visa. Gustavo Petro gave a speech in the United States where he criticized Trump, and right after the speech, his visa got revoked. Another example of, so like oftentimes like Trump will make like a big mess, and then Marco Rubio will be sent in there to like clean it up, because like I said, he's very charismatic. He can like sell absurd, barbaric shit. He can like negotiate with any kind of people. You see that like throughout his career, like in the Florida House, they're like, this is the guy that could talk to the Democrats. Like he's using those skills to sell colonialism under the Trump administration. So when Trump like last year was talking about seizing the Panama Canal because like a right-wing streamer, Lara Loomer, posted footage of like Chinese infrastructure and then also immigrants in Panama. And she was like, look at this Chinese controlled chaos. And Trump flipped out because he saw it on Twitter. And talked about seizing the Panama Canal. And then there was like mass protests in Panama saying the fuck you will. And so Marco Rubio was sent there to negotiate with the president of Panama to like calm things down. And that happens a lot. It happens a lot where Trump or the Trump administration will do something absurd and Marco Rubio is deployed to calm things down, to normalize it, to sell it. Another aspect of Trump or Rubio's leadership as Secretary of State is engaging in negotiations and cutting deals regarding immigration with far right-wing governments across Turtle Island. First and foremost being, of course, El Salvador under Bukele. Early on in the Trump administration, the second time around, Marco Rubio traveled to El Salvador to meet with Bukele and offered him $5 million to accept 250 Venezuelan immigrants at SICO, that maximum security detention center in El Salvador, where they like torture and starve people and disappear them. So Bukele took that money. And this is another callback to Marco Rubio's hypocrisy when it comes to drug trafficking, because Bukele, even though he's known internationally as like being hard on crime and like cutting the crime rate and murder rate and drug trafficking rate in El Salvador and like really being hard on the drug cartels, the way that he was able to do that, the way that Bukele was able to do that is by cutting deals directly with the gangs to halt the crime. He negotiated with them to reduce the crime rate. And then after they did it, he turned on them, mass arrested them, got others of them deported to the United States, and then said, I did that and I'm hard on drugs. And now he's like being celebrated. That's how the Trump administration started being like, look at this guy. Look at the success in El Salvador. Like, we need to learn from them. And like started talking about sending immigrants to SICO. But understand, Bukele worked hand in hand with the drug gangs in El Salvador. And there's like a really, really great documentary about it on PBS. I'll find it and I'll put it in the comments later on. But there was like a Colombian newspaper that did a shared documentary with PBS, I believe, talking about the situation with Bukele. So Marco Rubio, again, he on paper in his speeches, he says we have to stop the drug trade in the Western Hemisphere. We have to be hard on crime, like they're killing Americans, blah, 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 blah. But he has no problem whatsoever no problem whatsoever with cutting deals with all kinds of right-wing governments that are buddy with drug traffickers and have been the whole time. So his brother-in-law is a drug trafficker that he's homies with, and Bukele in El Salvador is a right-wing fascist who's homies with drug traffickers that Marco Rubio is homies with. So they don't like, do not buy when these people say that the point of US policy in Western America is to stop Americans from dying from drug addiction, stop Americans from dying from drug crime, because these same people are playing both sides. They're playing both sides. Also, another really clear example of how Marco Rubio has become the architect of US policy in Western America is, of course, the example of Venezuela. And if you understand how and why Marco Rubio and the Trump administration moved in Venezuela, you can understand what's happening in Cuba right now. Because the point of going for Venezuela, the point of going for Nicolas Maduro was to take away a source of support for the Cuban government. Cuba's primary suppliers of oil prior to the July 26th executive order that initiated the oil blockade were Mexico and Venezuela. Mexico was taken out of the game with the July 26th executive order. Venezuela was taken out of the game with the invasion, the US invasion on January 3rd. As soon as Nicolas Maduro and Celia Flores were deposed, the US government took control of Venezuela's oil supply and stopped them from sending oil to Cuba. That is how they were able to carry out this total oil blockade of the island. Cuba was always the target. Venezuela first, now Cuba. That was always the plan. And also, you have to understand where Marco Rubio comes from, because in that far right wing Cuban expat community in South Florida, they have dreamed, they have had fantasies for years about taking out Maduro, because they said if the Maduro regime falls, if the Maduro government falls, then Cuba is next. And so Rubio is acting to be a hero to these right-wing Cubans, these right-wing diasporas in Miami that are virulently anti-communist. Like, that is why they went so hard at Venezuela. And it didn't start in this year. It didn't start in the second Trump administration. It actually started in the first, where the Trump administration in 2019 initiated a maximum pressure campaign against Venezuela. Marco Rubio was one of the architects of that maximum pressure campaign. It was a combination of sanctions and diplomatic isolation targeting Venezuela to attempt to destroy the Venezuelan economy. Understand the long game. The invasion of Venezuela, the kidnapping of Nicolas Maduro happened in 2026. The maximum pressure campaign happened in 2019. So these people are patient. Also, I just want to say, like, when Trump won the second time, I was on a panel discussion with comrades from Venezuela, comrades from Nicaragua, and I was speaking from the NNOC, talking about U.S. policy towards Cuba. And the comrade from Venezuela said, the second Trump administration looks like it might be taking a different position when it comes to Venezuela, because they have this guy in place. His name is Richard Grenell, who Trump tapped to negotiate directly with the Maduro government. And Richard Grenell was able to get like concessions from the Venezuelan government. Like, they released political prisoners. They were discussing opening up priority access for U.S. oil companies. And so the comrade was like, this guy being in this position and Trump tapping him to do this is an indication that a new policy towards Venezuela might be coming. However, then Marco Rubio and like a little collective of right-wing Cubans in Congress, Carlos Jimenez, Maria Elvira Salazar, Mario Diaz-Balart, started saying the Trump administration is negotiating with a dictator. Why are you working with a dictator? Like, there should be no negotiations, overthrow. So they basically sabotaged the negotiations that Grenell was doing. And they also, in order to do that successfully, they said, unless the Trump administration abandoned those negotiations with the Maduro government, they would vote down a tax bill that Trump really, really wanted to pass. It was like the centerpiece of his agenda. So they basically coordinated to destroy that negotiation between governments that was happening in Venezuela that would have prevented a military operation. But I thought about that when I was doing the research for the show, like hearing that comrade say that there seemed to be like a different approach on the table from Trump the second time around, and then everything changed when Marco Rubio and his like little gaggle of hyenas, like right-wing Cuban American Congress people, got involved and said, stop negotiating. No. So instead, what happened is that they invaded Venezuela. They killed 100 people, including 32 Cubans. They kidnapped Nicolas Maduro and Celia Flores. And then Marco Rubio created a proposal for how to pressure Venezuela, where basically they said that we would invade and kill Delcy as well. We would apply additional sanctions unless y'all agree to hand over control of your oil to us. And that's precisely what happened. And then Rubio was basically put in as like a viceroy, like a liaison between the US government and the Venezuelan government, but effectively is like the main manager of the Venezuelan government and how it operates externally. So yeah, there was a very brief window where some kind of like diplomatic resolution to US attacks on Venezuela were on the table with Richard Greno, and then Marco Rubio and a number of right-wing Cubans worked together to destroy it and put the military operation on the table. And now we have the situation where we have now. Thank you, Marco Rubio. So let's see. Okay, so yeah, the U.S. takes over Venezuela. Rubio becomes the main conduit to the new government. His task is running the Venezuela state and stealing its oil. And then he threatens Venezuela to keep them around with it. And then also, last thing I'll say about Marco Rubio and U.S. policy towards Venezuela is that he doesn't always get his way. He was a supporter of that lady that got the Nobel Peace Prize, Maria Machado. I forget, it's like Maria Machado. He wanted her to take power in Venezuela instead of Delcy Rodriguez, because the right-wing Cubans in Miami are always about complete overthrow of revolutionary governments. They don't want a changing of the guard. They want the PSUV, the Communist Party of Cuba, out of power. And so Machado meant a complete break with the revolutionary government. And that is why Rubio and the right-wing Miami diaspora backed her. But Trump correctly assessed that she had no motion, that people in Venezuela did not even know who she was, and she was not going to be able to effectively rule that country for the United States because she had no base support. So yeah, he doesn't always get his way in terms of U.S. policy towards Latin America, and that's an example in the case of Venezuela. And I also think that we're seeing it in Cuba, because I think if Marco Rubio got his way, they would have been invaded Cuba. They would have been attacked Cuba. But because they're stuck in this fracas, this hot ass mess in Iran, because they painted themselves into a corner, I think that Trump is like a little bit wary about another military intervention. So I think that's really one of the main reasons that hasn't happened yet. If it was up to Marco Rubio, it would have been happened. Which brings me to the next part of his background that I would like to discuss: his tendency to kill his own people. He is, again, a Cuban American born in Miami to Cuban immigrant parents who has been instrumental, an architect of U.S. genocidal policy, not just towards Cuba, but to many, many different nations in Western America and around the world. He has publicly stated that when the Maduro government goes down in Venezuela, Havana would be next. I think after Nicolas Maduro was kidnapped, he said, if I was in Havana right now, I'll be really nervous, like bragging about the violence and destruction that the Trump administration had carried out. In Trump's second term, the Trump administration terminated the TPS program, which allowed Cubans, Haitians, Venezuelans, and Nicaraguans to remain in the United States. And the ending of that program led to the deportation of thousands of Cubans and Venezuelans from Miami. And Marco Rubio did not say a word. And in Miami, the people were really pissed off because they had been in the United States, oftentimes with no criminal charges, living lives fully integrated into society, and all of a sudden they were going to work and getting kidnapped on the way and being deported or being sent to Alcatraz, the immigration detention center built by Ron DeSantis in South Florida with FEMA money. That money did not come from the feds. He used Florida state FEMA money to build that shit, and now it's closing and it's not going to be paid back, and it's almost hurricane season. Anyway, so that happened. Thousands of Cubans were deported. Many were put into detention centers. Rubio did not say a word. Those 3 Cuban American Congress people that were so gung-ho about military action in Venezuela, the same Congress people, by the way, that called for the indictment of Raul Castro for the Brothers to the Rescue, shutting down of the right-wing Cubans. The same 3 Congress people, Maria Elvira Salazar, Mario Diaz-Balart, and Carlos Jimenez, who said no negotiating with Maduro. We only want military action. We only want the overthrow of this government. Those same 3 Congress people and Marco Rubio did not say a word as their constituents were targeted by the Trump administration's immigration policy. And so they were putting out billboards in Miami, calling them traitors with their pictures on it. People were pissed off that these people who were elected to serve them did not lift a finger as they were being persecuted persecuted by the Trump administration. So yeah, wow, wild. So the right-wing Cubans, many Cubans in Miami felt betrayed by Marco Rubio because he aligned with the Trump administration on this policy. They were putting up billboards, they were calling them out. But I just want to say, if he is willing to starve an island full of his relatives, like cousins, second cousins, family members, like people like him, his own people, why do you think that he would lift a finger to stop mass deportation of those people from Florida? Like, he's not going to do that. He is more aligned with U.S. imperialism. He is more aligned with U.S. settler colonialism than he is with any kind of Cuban people, no matter where they are, whether it's Florida, whether it's the island of Cuba. He does not give a damn. His allegiance is to the U.S. empire and also to himself. He sees himself in that White House. He sees himself in that Oval Office. He will do anything it takes to get there, including sell out his own people. And so I understand. If I were a right-wing Cuban in Miami and I had like locked in and aligned with virulent anti-communism and racism and got these people into Congress and was like, yeah, they're just like me. They're on my side. And then they started deporting me and my family members and my cousins, I would be pissed off and confused too. I understand the billboards, but what those Cubans have to realize that there is a class contradiction at play here. These people are not on your side. And in fact, their antipathy to communism, their antipathy to the Cuban government, their antipathy to Venezuela is not about freedom or human rights or democracy. It's about class. They want to benefit from the recolonization of these nations. The recolonization, which would mean a drastic destruction of the material conditions of the people living there. They don't give a damn. They don't give a damn. They just want to profit. They just want power. That is the lesson that the Cubans and the right-wing diasporas that are getting deported, that are being targeted, are waking up to. But I keep saying that Marco Rubio was the architect of Trump administration policy towards Cuba, that he has intentionally pushed policies that has led to mass starvation and suffering of his own people as a Cuban American. And so I want to talk about what that has looked like. Marco Rubio loves to talk about incompetent communists running Cuba. He actually acknowledged in a hearing the collective nature of decision-making within the Cuban state while imposing additional sanctions to suffocate the Cuban people. He was like, someone asked, like, if the Cuban government falls, is there someone who can like take power? Or is there someone who will be on our side when it comes to destroying socialism in Cuba? And he said in the hearing, you know, that they make decisions collectively. So there isn't just one person that we could look to make that call or to take that position. And that is like a tacit admission that Cuba is not a dictatorship, like on record in like a US Congress hearing. But no one ever pays attention to these things, man. But they know it's not a dictatorship. They know 95 Raul Castro is not single-handedly running a country of 11 people. They know the shit they're saying about Cuba is not true. And they're marketing it directly to South Florida. So actually, I want to, before I get into how he has attacked Cuba specifically, I want to play a clip of Marco Rubio's remarks shortly after the indictment of Raul Castro for the Brothers to the Rescue shooting.
Castro's grandson or
look, we remain. Here's the problem we have. We'll engage with the Cubans. We have. Our ambassadors met with them recently. The CIA director was down there a few weeks ago. There's some State Department communications that occur. I just don't see a lot of, at the end of the day, they got to make a decision. Their system doesn't work, right? Their economic system does not work. It's broken. And you can't fix it with the current political system that's in place. They just don't comprehend how to do it. And it's a failed state. Like, their economy and the model they're trying to follow in Cuba doesn't resemble what anyone is doing anywhere in the world. I mean, there are other ways to do it that can provide the people of Cuba prosperity and opportunity. And it's what I said in the video to them the other day. You look at Cuba, in the Bahamas, in Jamaica, in the Dominican Republic, here in Florida. Cuba's surrounded by places where people have the right to do things like own a business, work for themselves, and be able to vote and for the leaders that govern them and or replace them. So if that's possible all around Cuba, why isn't it possible? Why is that not possible inside of Cuba? And right now, there just doesn't seem to be people over there in charge of the regime who are in any way open to any of those changes. And the things they talk about economically are cosmetic in nature. They're not real, because that's what they've gotten used to all these years, is just buying time and waiting us out. They're not going to be able to wait us out or buy time. We're very serious. We're very focused. As I told you a moment ago, in the context of Iran, the president's preference is always a negotiated agreement that's peaceful. That's always our preference. That remains our preference with Cuba. I'm just being honest with you. You know, the likelihood of that happening, given who we're dealing with right now, is not high. But if they have a change of heart we're here. And in the meantime, we'll keep doing what we need to do.
It sounds a lot like nation building. The administration doesn't believe in using force for nation building.
No, it's not nation building. It's not nation building. We are addressing something that's directly related to the national security of the United States. We are involved in places all over the world. You're asking me about Ebola. Important. But Ebola's in Africa. Cuba's 90 miles from our shores. So if you have...
Anyway, that's enough of that. So that's, again, Marco Rubio speaking to the press shortly after the indictment of Raul Castro by the U.S. government for the Brothers to the Rescue shooting, which we already talked about that shit. It was nonsense. It was Cuba acting in self-defense. But in any case, he says a couple of things in that clip that I just want to highlight. One, that he calls Cuba a failed state, that he says that its system of functioning does not work, and that the people in power are too stubborn and incompetent, are incapable of organizing the state differently, and so that people need to come in and do something about it. He also says that having a failed state 90 miles off the coast of the United States is a threat to U.S. national security. So having said that, now I want to talk about precisely what kind of policy towards Cuba Marco Rubio has pushed the United States to have. So one of the things that the State Department under Marco Rubio has done is to pressure nations around the world to cut ties with Cuba. An example of this is that they have been going nation to nation in Western America, in the Caribbean, blackmailing them into giving up contracts with Cuban doctors. And the problem with that, off top, one, like nations have the right to decide who their friends are and like who provides medical support and like what aid looks like. First of all, so the U.S. should not be doing that. But second of all, in a lot of nations all over the world, not just in Western America, that have been forced into capitalism and have no functioning public health system, Cuban doctors represent the only access to healthcare available. So the U.S. government is blackmailing nations into giving up the Cuban doctors. It's not sending replacements and instead just leaving a vacuum of care in place after place after place, because they don't care about the nations that don't have doctors anymore. They don't care about the fact that capitalism prevents those nations from meeting the basic needs of its citizens. They only care about making sure that Cuba is increasingly isolated. And so that is why they're saying, get rid of the doctors, and they're not sending anymore. Another thing the State Department has done under Marco Rubio is ahead of every single year, the UN General Assembly votes on a resolution condemning the U.S. blockade on Cuba. And every single year, the vast majority of the nations in the world vote to condemn the U.S. blockade on Cuba and say it needs to end. This past vote last fall, prior to the vote on the resolution condemning the blockade, the State Department under Marco Rubio sent letters to nations threatening to sanction them if they voted in favor of the resolution condemning the blockade. Again, tactics of blackmail, targeting nations already being exploited, already impoverished under capitalism, attempting to isolate Cuba. The U.S. cannot give them a better deal. It cannot say, hey, we'll help you out if you don't work with Cuba. Instead, they say, we're going to hurt you. We're going to starve you. We're going to sanction you if you don't stop working with Cuba. Like, that's how the U.S. functions. It never is like a positive pressure. It's always like starvation, suffering, etc. Additionally, like I mentioned at the top of the show, Marco Rubio is responsible for pushing the Trump administration to put Cuba back on that list of state sponsors of terrorism. He's also responsible for the Trump administration's reactivation of Title III of the Helms-Burton Act, which allows companies to sue the Cuban government for damages from the Cuban Revolution, meaning that the Cuban people organized and took back their land and resources. And the Title III of the Helms-Burton Act basically says that companies can sue them for doing that. Sue them for taking back what was stolen from them in the first place. That's bananas. Additionally, the State Department under Marco Rubio reestablished the list of restricted Cuban entities, meaning entities and individuals that people from the U.S. are prohibited from conducting business with. They recently put ECAP, the Cuban Institute for Friendship with the People, and Amnesty on that list of restricted entities. Again, that is a deliberate and direct attempt to sever ties between the Solidarity Movement and the Cubans, and that's not going to work. We will not be intimidated, but understand that's the intent. They are going for key industries in Cuba to attempt to cut off every possible lifeline. Energy, mining, tourism. In that video, he says that the Cuban government invests money in hotels, like make sure that the hotels have lights and they're denying access to the Cuban people. They can't keep the lights on. But the reason why the Cuban government has to invest in tourism, has to invest in hotels, is precisely because the blockade has cut off so many other types of income. They're economically isolating and strangling Cuba. Cuba turns to tourism to get dollars, to get cash, to be able to meet the needs of its citizens. And then the US sanctions the state tourism company. You understand that they're going at place after place after place to try to cut off every possible source of support the Cuban government has to suffocate the Cuban people. And then they point the finger at the Cuban government as being to blame when they're intentionally doing that. Oh my God. So that, again, Marco Rubio identifying the soft spots, the places that are going to hurt the most in terms of targeting the Cuban people and leading the Trump administration and the State Department in the policies to carry that out. He has also reissued and made amendments to Presidential Memorandum 5 on strengthening U.S. policy towards Cuba. That's what it's called, which reaffirms the maximum pressure policy started with the first Trump administration and expands trade restrictions. And like I already mentioned, every couple of weeks, there are additional sanctions on new Cuban entities, the sanctions on Gaiza, the sanctions on Miguel Diaz-Canel, the sanction on so many different Cuban institutions, again, targeting key industries to attempt to cut off every possible source of support. And again, the point of this policy from Marco Rubio is to appeal directly to his base, those right-wing Cubans in Miami, even though he left them out to dry by backing the Trump administration policy that saw them getting deported by the thousands, not just to Cuba, but to random ass places all over the world, any nation that they could pay to take undocumented people. The Trump administration sent them money and then just sent them to random ass places. And they also locked them in concentration camps where they've been dying with mysterious injuries ever since. So he completely abandoned these right-wing Cubans to the Trump administration policy, didn't say a word or lift a finger when DeSantis put them in alligator Alcatraz, but he still wants their political support because he still has those presidential aspirations. And so he is leaning on the ideological rationality of this base of right-wing Cubans by going for the Cuban government, by going for the Cuban revolution. He is depending upon their virulent anti-communism, their deeply irrational hatred of a Cuban government that most of them are not even really familiar with, to make sure to say, hey, I'm going at the people you hate. Vote for me, support me. That's literally what he's doing. They reward him for attacking Cuba, even as he abandons them materially. That is the whole point. He is still trying to get to the White House. He is still trying to get that Oval Office. He wants to be the guy that took out communism in Cuba. So he has like the perfect legacy secured to get that chair in the executive office. So what does Marco Rubio's career tell us about his ideology, about what he believes? Like I said, this man, really, his main loyalty is to U.S. imperialism and to himself. He started off as like a neoliberal, all about that soft power, all about that U.S. aid, all about that color revolution strategy. Now he's American first, small government. I was pro-U.S. aid. Now I'm anti-U.S. aid, MAGA, whatever. He will say whatever and do whatever. Whatever the new hotness is, he is jumping on board. Because as long as U.S. imperialism is furthered, as long as his own political catch is furthered, he does not give a damn. He is a company man. He is a true gusano. He also is, because he is an ardent defender and supporter and enabler of U.S. imperialism, he is also an ardent defender of like so-called Western civilization, which really just means white civilization. Anytime someone says Western civilization, just think white civilization. Like that is what that speech in Munich was about. That was Marco Rubio, a Cuban American born in Miami, Florida, telling the nations of Europe that they need to join with the United States and fight for the white race, fight for white nationalism. Like that is what the hell that was. And he's barely even white. Goddamn. He is also a strident anti-communist. Like the roots of that are, of course, his upbringing among the right-wing expat community in South Florida. But it was concretized in his political career in the Senate, on the House Foreign Relations Committee alongside Bob Menendez, and also on the Intelligence Committee. Like he is a committed anti-communist. That is also why he is extremely, extremely anti-China. So anti-China that he was banned from entering the country and sanctioned by the Chinese government. Like he was not allowed to go into China until he became Secretary of State. And they were like, I guess we have to talk to this man now. And so they let him in. He is also a competent spokesperson for racist and demonic behavior and also U.S. imperialist failure. I want to read a quote from a New Yorker profile about him because I feel like it's perfect. As Trump lurches from one crisis to another, Rubio, calm, articulate, and capable of projecting a Boy Scout's earnest charm, justifies his policies, soothes rattled allies, and puts the best face on initiatives that only a few years ago he would have denounced. So every single time Trump makes a new mess, every single time Pete Hegseth, what's the other guy, Stephen Miller, whatever Trump administration figure makes a new mess, a new disaster, they will send out Marco Rubio to smooth it over, to sell it to the public, to act like everything's normal. Like when J.D. Vance was attacking the Pope of all, like the Catholic Church has gone hard for Western imperialism, man. Like they helped conquer the Western America, Turtle Island, for imperialism. Like they have put in work for the counter-revolution in Cuba, and the Trump administration still was insulting them. J.D. Vance was insulting them because the new Pope, I think, made a statement opposing the war in Iran. That's what happened. The new Pope was like, what the hell is this? Like everybody else. And then J.D. Vance came out and was like, fuck the Pope. And so because the U.S. government, U.S. imperialism requires smooth relations with the Catholic Church because they've been allies with imperialism for a long ass time, they sent Marco Rubio to the Vatican to smooth it over. So every single time there's a mess that needs cleaning up, here comes Marco Rubio. And usually you can tell he doesn't even really agree with it, but he's still going to say it because he's a company man. He doesn't really believe in anything except white supremacy, Western imperialism, and his own political advancement. So really everything else is on the table for a negotiation. That's what I mean by a worm, man. So like I said, his main objective, his clear objective, his long-term goal is to win the U.S. presidency. So I just want to take a second to reflect upon what would U.S. President Marco Rubio look like. We can see with the maximum pressure campaigns that he architected against Venezuela and Cuba, that economic sanctions and legal pressure to cause starvation and suffering would be a key tactic of U.S. imperialism under President Rubio. Pete Hegseth and Trump, they like to be talking, they like to bluster, they like to talk about how powerful the U.S. military is while the U.S. military is losing. Marco Rubio is the one that's like, this is exactly what we need to do to kill more babies, to starve more grandmas. Like that is his approach, and that is what we could expect. Additionally, we can see in the ways that he has weaponized visa power as U.S. Secretary of State to target opponents of the Trump administration, protesters, protesting genocide, that we can expect escalated domestic repression under a President Rubio. So it's not just that they're going to be starving and sanctioning the entire world, which should be enough to get us moving, but also understand that this man is committed to the internal counter-revolution, targeting you and targeting I. It's like that defense of the West shit, it also extends to us inside the United States. And again, he is able to use whatever position he occupies to wage that counter-revolution right now with the visa power. He is not stupid. He's a clown. He's a worm. He's an opportunist, but he is not stupid. He is, in fact, quite disciplined, quite articulate, and quite ruthless. You would have to be ruthless to willingly starve again an island of 11 million people, a lot of whom are related to you. He is an agent of empire who believes in nothing but his own political advancement. He will abandon any principle, any tactic, if it means it will get him ahead. He is also, like I said, willing to starve an island full of people to get what he wants. That shows you how ruthless he is. So at the beginning of the show, when I talked about how today is the anniversary of when the July 26th movement was founded, I also said that those Cubans, Raul Castro, Fidel Castro, Juan Almaguer Bosque, Camilo Cienfuegos, represented the kind of individuals that are produced in a revolutionary struggle for liberation. And then I also said that Marco Rubio is an example of the kind of individuals that is produced under settler-colonialism and U.S. imperialism. Fidel Castro, Raul Castro, Miguel Diaz-Canel, our comrades at ECAP, these are the products of a Cuban revolutionary process, a progressive process of transformation carried out across the whole of society. This Cuban American, this man born in Miami, serving in the Trump administration that worked his way throughout the ranks, he is an example of the kind of colonized person, the kind of working class person produced by U.S. imperialism. When they say climb the ladder and get to the top, Marco Rubio is what that looks like. Marco Rubio is what they're talking about abandoning every principle covering for drug traffickers, allying with fascists and white supremacists across the Western Hemisphere and across the world, and learning to smile while selling barbarism and bullshit. That is the kind of Cuban that US imperialism produces. And so understand that when we fight for the Cuban Revolution, when we fight against the blockade, we are fighting for a process that produces a new kind of revolutionary human. We are fighting for a process that will end the production of new Marco Rubios. And so that is why we want to do the show focus on him today, to unpack how deeply implicated he is in genocidal policy towards Cuba, but also to unpack how he was a true product of US imperialism. Like, that is why he is like this, because he grew up here, he was developed here, he is a product of this place. Anywho, we are moving to the close of the show. I actually have 5 minutes. Let's see what I can do. So network updates. The National Network on Cuba is a network of over 50 social justice organizations united in action to end genocidal U.S. policy towards Cuba and end all U.S. attempts to harm the Cuban people and overthrow their revolution. Our purpose is to end the U.S. blockade on Cuba, end U.S. war against Cuba, and defend Cuba's right to self-determination. We also need to, in this moment, defend the Cuban Revolution as a collective project of the Cuban people. Please understand, we need more Fidels. We need more Rauls. We need more Diaz-Canels. We do not need more traitors like Marco Rubio. We cannot allow U.S. imperialism to warp and destroy so many diasporas. My God, imagine if his family had stayed in Cuba. How different his trajectory would probably be. Jeez. So we need people to get active for the International Week of Action for No War on Cuba. Again, that's happening June 28th to July 4th. Hit nowaroncuba.com for resources for local organizing. And now, just a reminder that we are bringing 2 planes full of material aid to Cuba with the Centennial Fidel Brigade, organized by the National Network on Cuba and the Benson Edwards Brigade. We are trying to raise $100,000 to fill 2 planes of aid. I have put on the screen a QR code that you can scan with your phone right now to be brought to the fundraiser page to make a donation. Please, 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 if you got $5, if you got $10, if you got $50, $100, any amount counts and helps get us closer to our goal. We must, in this moment, continue our fierce and disciplined solidarity with the Cuban people. We cannot be intimidated by the likes of Marco Rubio, a man who believes in nothing, a worm. Absolutely not. Lock in and redouble our efforts to be in solidarity with the Cuban Revolution. Help us fill 2 charter planes full of aid and also donate to the IFCO Pastors for Peace fundraiser as well. That link is in the chat. So this has been the Revolution with the Revolution podcast. My name is Onya Sanu. I am one of 2 hosts. The second host will be back next week, hopefully. And next week, we're going to be talking about Operation Northwoods. We briefly mentioned it on the show before. It is a CIA-backed military operation seeking to establish a pretext for U.S. military intervention against Cuba. So we're going to be talking about that because it's really relevant. It's really relevant right now as Marco Rubio attempts to provoke a U.S. intervention in Cuba, attempts to suffocate and starve the Cuban people to death. We have to understand the different strategies that U.S. imperialism has used to attack the Cuban Revolution. So tune into that next week at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. And once again, please get active in the International No War on Cuba campaign. Week of Action is June 28th to July 4th. Find resources for local organizing at nowaroncuba.com. Please get involved in the struggle comrades and have a great rest of your day.
Eran las 3 de la mañana, 3 de enero en el calendario. Caracas dormía tranquila bajo su manto diario, pero el cielo no trajo sol, trajo un ruido de metal y en Fuerte Tiuna se rompió el silencio habitual. No fueron truenos de lluvia, fueron botas extranjeras que cruzaron sin permiso nuestras líneas y fronteras. La noticia corre como pólvora, la pantalla se congela. Se han llevado al presidente, hay fuego en Venezuela. Liberen a Nicolás, grita una parte del mapa. Mientras la garra del norte su sentencia destapa. Dicen que va hacia el norte sobre el mar prisionero, en las entrañas de acero de Oye, Moscú, escuchas el eco en el Caribe. Si cae un socio, el equilibrio no sobrevive. Pekín levanta la vista, el dragón debe mirar que las flotas del imperio han vuelto a navegar. Hermano en La Habana, sandinista en Nicaragua, saben que esta misma lluvia mañana será su agua. Si hoy tocan a uno y lo sacan de su cama, mañana su justicia incendiará toda la rama. Dicen que el Iwo Jima navega con la presa, que van rumbo a Nueva York a servirlo en la mesa. Trump firma la orden, Petro mira con espanto. ¿Es justicia o es venganza lo que cubre con su manto? Las bombas en la Carlota dejaron su marca en el suelo. Un pájaro de hierro se lo llevó en pleno vuelo. Para el que celebra en Miami, para el que llora en el barrio, esto no es solo un hombre, es un cambio de escenario. La soberanía sangra cuando el juez es el verdugo y la libertad no nace bajo la sombra del yugo. Venezolano, despierta, sea cual sea tu color. Hoy tu tierra fue pisada por la bota del invasor. El mundo aguanta la respiración, la moneda está en el aire. Nadie sabe el costo, nadie sabe el desaire. Desde el sur hasta el oriente, el mensaje es duro. Me respetan a los pueblos, me liberen a Maduro.